Today's session is meant to be in interactive format, so please don't hesitate to join the discussion round and feel free to post your questions, your comments. All sessions will be recorded.
I will now give you a short overview. We are a research project called Speculative Space, which is located at the Center for Design Research at HAW Hamburg. We are 8 researchers coming from very different backgrounds. The main question of our research is about the epistemic potentials of speculation. We try to find out which forms of specific knowledge are produced by processes that work speculatively or from a speculative position. Speculation can question the status quo or what is believed to be something like a general truth or unquestioned knowledge. We assume that there is many possible forms of creating knowledge or insight. Embedded within this research project is this series of talks in which we search for the potentials of speculation. This is an ongoing project. We will invite different artists, scientists, researchers, and designers who work in different contexts and ways with speculative tactics or approaches or fields that we find interesting within this context. The focus of the first block is on Afrofuturistic positions. This will be followed by contributions on feminist speculation, stock exchange specialists, divination, and hopefully other fields. We hope to discover links, connections, and points of contact with very different fields for a speculative design practice. If anyone wants to have the long version of this introduction, you can go to speclog.xyz.
I'm going to hand over.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to welcome Lina to Potentials of Speculation today. Lina, you're a researcher and a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics at York University in Toronto, Canada. So it's a little earlier where you are. So your work connects topics like the politics of technology, race, imagination, to labor and labor organizing and localism under capitalism. And you can see her, Lina's Twitter handle and her email address here on this slide. Lina is also always interested in collaborations, so if you have ideas, if this sparks any new ideas and interests, please don't hesitate to contact her. Today, you will be talking about confronting alienation in the neoliberal city, and this talk aims to introduce its listeners to the intersection of speculative philosophy and materialist politics. And we're asking, or you're asking, what can be understood by adding the speculative dimension to our understanding of the problems that we're facing right now and that our future selves are facing. And specifically, you will be talking also a lot about the concept of blackness and alienation. And we would ask you to focus on those and see where we can take the concept and the explanation of the concept, where your imagination will take you also for the discussion afterwards. So welcome, Lina. Thank you for being here. And the stage is yours. You tell me like how to share, what to do, and I'll be your hand, digital hand.
Okay, thank you guys so much for inviting me. For the slides, Petra, you can just let them roll. There's not, they don't like fully line up with what I'm saying, but it's just quotes that I picked out and some images, so they can just keep moving, you know. Okay, so I'll just get into it because I want us to get to the discussion. So I'm going to start with a prompt from the Black Quantum Futurism Collective about time travel in traditional science fiction. So they say it treats temporal paradoxes, temporal queerness, or temporal conflicts as undesirable and capable of ripping apart the fabric of space-time. Literally, queer and trans people are rarely depicted as time travelers or time displaced. The universe must always be set right or balanced, which usually involves a linear trajectory centered around white, patriarchal, cisgendered, heterosexual histories and timelines, and ensuring that a future that maintains the status quo. So what I love about this analysis is that it confirms for me what I observe as a serious deficiency in how we imagine the future today. That in fact, traditional science fiction and its construction of time and temporality leaves it largely undisturbed. Time being the key element here in speculative philosophy or speculation is simply reproduced in its traditional past, present, future formulation. And what that tells us is that what has already happened can't really be changed, and if it is, it will disturb some sort of inherent harmony or balance, as they said, and its forward trajectory of what is to come, if it can't be anticipated, in a sense, it's undesirable. So this is important because of what it reinforces, and as they tell us, that's the status quo. So often attempts to think about the future based on advancements in science and tech, machines and design, are devoid of the social considerations of who is the subject that we're designing this future for, and who is excluded from our imaginings. So what's at stake in these kinds of questions? It's the recovery of past cycles of futurity and a derailing of the sort of technocratic futures that are being currently dispatched. As corporations seek to manage the unknown through scenario-based decisions, and while civil society responds to future shocks through habits outlined in science fiction, the figure of the alien can be mobilized as a program for recovering histories, counter futures, and as a space for the critical work of manufacturing the tools capable of destabilizing the neoliberal futures industry. And I'll explain a little bit what that is in a bit. So in fashioning the future, design both as a way of thinking and as an industry is a site of future control and its reproduction. So that makes it a site of power. So for those seeking to challenge linear time, the problem, of course, is how to reconfigure our relationship to this ordering so as to be able to fabricate, alter, design different realities and access different possibilities here and now. In this sense, Afrofuturism's relationship to time can help us better understand the limitations of linearity. By probing the conditions of possibility beyond hyperbolic tropes of the current futures on offer, Afrofuturism aims to conjure new tomorrows through a focus on the creative power of non-being, disconnection, displacement, exploitation, and alienation. A defatalizing of the present, to borrow a phrase from Agatha and Killian's work. So Afrofuturism, often advanced and promoted by queer Black women, centers the experience of Blackness in order to conjure its new worlds. And it synthesizes a series of what could be called alien on earth approaches, effectively collapsing hard distinctions between past, present, and future by weaving social reality into future analysis. So when we imagine the future, what do we see? It seems we see more of the same capitalist values, the sites of invisibility, and while the actual present pales in comparison to the product-saturated future to which we are told to aspire. When this particular future is routinely invoked to obscure the present in all its anxiety and exploitation, the power of falsification, the drive to rewrite reality, and a will to produce all plausible alternatives becomes fundamental to challenging the status quo. So when I was thinking about this, I thought, okay, why don't we think about how climate change has been represented to us in fiction and reality? So largely we get two things. Either scenes of dystopian destruction, a no way out kind of scenario, and it requires future technology to even remotely survive those conditions. Or we're offered the sort of techno-utopia of AI and its possibilities. Take Elon Musk's vision for the future. It addresses climate change with electric cars, solar panels for the present, and of course, this project of colonization on Mars in the future. So Musk's project of Martian colonization is symptomatic of the poverty of this colonial capitalist present. Musk's corporate practices are not utopian, nor are they world building. And as is indicative of the long-standing relationship between science, tech, and power, the work of SpaceX and other private research endeavors are made possible largely through government contracts and public funds. So SpaceX, the recipient of approximately $4.9 billion in US government subsidies, including grants, tax breaks, factory construction, discounted loans, environmental credits, is possible because of its monopoly over future imagination. So as silly as some of his project sounds, or much of it sounds, it actively shapes our vision of what a sustainable future could even look like. What is seemingly never asked, of course, is those questions that ultimately expose this future as a subjugation of our present reality. So who's going to Mars? Is it Musk? Is it philanthro-capitalists like Musk? Is it the West condemning the rest of the world to climate catastrophe caused largely by Western production and consumption? So what historical, ideological, patriarchal, and colonial visions of society are they going to take with them? What about some of the other ways we imagine and create a sort of better future? Green fixes like tax credits and rebates to those buyers of solar panels and electric cars, without any question to whose future this will be when the majority of the world and many in Western societies cannot access this future present. Who owns the electric car? The solar paneled home. Another example is this something I grabbed from a list of the top 10 new inventions for the future. And it's vertical or indoor farming. So it's here to solve our problems of land, time, and the uncertainty of nature. It's a solution which boasts growing plants hydroponically, so without soil, in large multi-story buildings under artificial light. The crops can be stacked on top of each other and grown far more quickly than with traditional farming methods. So, but rather than environmental sustainability, economic productivity and profit remain the key metrics of its success here. So with the claim to produce up to 100 times more food and meeting a growing population's demands, this solution neither accounts for the problems of who lacks access to food, where is food being produced, and what are the material and social impacts of these localities, and what are the ways in which we sustain farming and farmers, particularly in the context of a racialized and gendered global South, who will face head-on the immediate effects of climate change, as well as their marginalization in the supply chain. For these questions, either implicitly or explicitly, they're at the core of Afrofuturism's toolkit for imagining the future and its possibilities. So across the spectrum of popular science fiction, the future no longer functions to prompt us to imagine something other than the present, but it simply exists as the specter of its intensification. The obfuscation of the present is only furthered in the space of future imagination, due to how the ideas and advancements in technology have been deployed by power. So now the work of future imagination encompasses not only science fiction, of course, but also the work of artists, economists, designers, scientists, the state apparatus, and anyone who must account for the unknown. The widespread use of this future imagination is visible in many ways already, through things like predictive or preemptive technology. So in a move reminiscent of Philip K. Dick's The Minority Report, the rise of preemptive policing, where algorithms identify and target recidivists, so those likely to recommit, as well as those who haven't been convicted of crimes, but who police suspect will be at risk of committing future crimes. So this supposedly new technology only furthers to target and harass and alienate those deemed undesirable in our present realities. So Black and Indigenous populations, trans people, migrants, foreigners. This technology does not identify criminals, but it in fact produces them. Another example would be the use of preemptive drone strikes, a distinctly 21st century phenomenon. It fabricates a reality and that was initially a speculation. You bomb somewhere, and then afterwards you find the enemy you expected to find. And it reproduces enemies most beneficial to the present conditions, be it the populations in Africa and the Middle East, or other alien threats we conjure throughout the world. This cannot be understood, of course, as a logic of prevention from a previous era. Power today preempts the future, making it a reality in the present. Adopting these configurations of the future are in fact an endorsement of the present power structure and a desire for its continuation. As Afrofuturist philosopher, as I'll call him, Kodwo Eshun writes, it is clear that power now operates predictively as much as retrospectively through the envisioning, management, and delivery of reliable futures. And this is what him and others often refer to as making up a futures industry. So in the context of neoliberal society, where the relationship between technology and social formations have been deployed to disguise the exact problems of disconnection, displacement, exploitation, and alienation, we must ask ourselves what are the implications of the status quo belief in the possibility of an objective reality, informed by the progressive forces of science and technology. The common narratives of who we are, where we come from, and where we're headed are rarely subjected to analysis in the mainstream, despite the obvious consequences for our shared social and ethical order. Science and technology are fundamentally embedded in these narratives. So the technological determinism of the 20th century have paved the way for the 21st century incorporation of the idea of science as objective and inherently progressive. And this is evidenced by traditional science fiction's tool-based approach to imagining the future. In spite of this, reality, of course, has proven to be quite dystopian, particularly for those marginalized and excluded from our collective world building. The current climate of social division, cynicism, political impotence, environmental defeatism, and economic and technological anxiety only highlight this fact. Ruha Benjamin, in her recent book, Race After Technology, refers to this phenomenon as the New Jim Code, defining it as the employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequities, but that are promoted and perceived as more objective or progressive than the discriminatory systems of a previous era. So let's say today explicitly racist laws are no longer on the books, yet racism continues in many areas of life as a result of the vast carceral apparatus that facilitates legal discrimination against those marked with a criminal record. So while Black people in the abstract enjoy greater freedom of movement, in practice, many are immobilized by an elaborate and tech-savvy, we can add, justice system. And for every negative outcome that we have, it is largely dismissed as a glitch rather than a fundamental element of the technological design. Speculation as a strategy is and has been deployed by the state through policing, military, and most recently, we could say in election-specific advertising. It has been deployed by capital through predictive algorithms and personality profiling in order to boost sales and profits. This, of course, doesn't mean that it doesn't have potential for producing radical alternatives, but rather it's to emphasize that it is already in use to further intensify society's present conditions. Many have relied on speculative philosophy because of its challenge to the idea of a fixed reality, but we must understand it as a space of contestation, meaning control over who gets to imagine the future is actively being fought over right now. So much of the content of Afrofuturism deals explicitly with the social, its relationship to technology, and both the consequences and possibilities. So through what I'll call its alien politics, it advances that neither the overcoming of organic mechanic dualisms or a redefining of its roots is useful to us. So in exploring the possibilities of extraterrestrial futures through what is deemed alien, as a material semiotic figure, we can displace the dualisms encoded onto the human subject: organic mechanic, body mind, man woman, cis trans, black white, hetero homo, citizen non-citizen, etc. In this regard, the alien, unlike the hybridized subjectivity of the cyborg, for instance, functions as a vector for transvaluation, a force existing or coming from somewhere beyond our current planetary and technological assemblages of future control. Alien politics exposes how the inhuman already exists within the confines of human life. Exploring alienation and the figure of the alien is not new, of course. Theorists of race in particular have critiqued humanist discourses and discussed alienation as inseparable from the histories of racial violence, colonialism, and slavery. By prioritizing alien possibilities, Afrofuturism liberates that which is marginalized here and now and constrained by historical and temporal ordering processes and by the trajectory of the historical archive. By challenging a future that is routinely invoked to hide the present in all its horrors and unhappiness, Afrofuturism's alien locates clear political interventions in the assembling of conceptual approaches and what Eshin called counter-memory practices. And he described that as an ethical commitment to history, the dead, and the forgotten, a version of time travel, if you will. It does so in order to remove and put back into circulation previously inaccessible experiences and histories as a means for reprogramming the present. Alienation in this context is neither utopian nor forward-looking. By engineering feedback between an imagined future and an unfolding present, alienation generates what Eshin calls an artificial discontinuum that cuts through the digital futures offered to us, those of ubiquitous sameness, symmetry, and affirmation. So as a subject, a migrant, a foreigner, an affect, an aesthetic, a relation to the mode of production, and more, through the alien, we can move beyond the normalization of Silicon Valley futures. After all, the alien is simultaneously not of this world and an alien on Earth. I think here of the United States' continued use of the word alien to be synonymous with foreigner. The alien is the migrant from a developing country, the descendants of slavery, those on the receiving end of Western military violence. The alien is trans, is poor, is a single mother. The alien is invisible in our future imaginary because it does not fit into our conjured utopia or ideal. So I just want to emphasize that despite what it might seem like, Afrofuturism for me is an heir to Western philosophy, and I believe it to be an interlocutor in the Western tradition. And that's important because it's responding directly to the conditions of life in Western society. And because it does not cover the multitude of responses that are present or coming out of, let's say, the African context or beyond, right? So it's important that in these discussions of alienation, that we take them up within the broader context of race, colonialism, and slavery. Alienation as a condition of being is exemplified by those who have been denied history. This is important because it makes future orientation a necessity as opposed to power's deliberate distortion of the past. So it's important that these discussions of alienation be taken up within the broader context of race, colonialism, and slavery. And for that reason, I want to take the conversation back to the Black radical tradition and its grappling with the concept of alienation. So from historians W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Gilroy, C.L.R. James, to authors Toni Morrison, Octavia Butler, as well as through contemporary Black music and arts, alienation has proved key to the experience of Blackness as such. And the Black tradition has provided us with some very good insight into understanding this alienation. So as Afrofuturism has made alienation central to its analysis and expression, I think it's important to sort of engage with that conversation. So we can't understand a future-oriented project like Afrofuturism without understanding the genealogy of its alienation. And as a student of theory, that means returning to those who sought to liberate Blackness from its historical constraints and limitations. Those who sought to fulfill the Enlightenment project of humanism, or at least expand its reach. I want to return to, sorry, I just want to make sure, can you guys still hear me? Yeah, okay. So I want to return the conversation to Frantz Fanon. And writing in the 1950s in his book, Black Skins, White Masks, he writes, "It will be seen that the Black man's alienation is not an individual question. It is a psychosocial question that concerns the idea of Blackness and what it represents." Fanon, being a psychiatrist, wanted to focus on this particular element, but he was always aware of the full dimensions of this alienation and its reliance on a social and economic inferiority, which he described as being epidermalized or embedded in the skin. Fanon's work explores the Black subject and consciousness. In order to do so, he engages directly with the work of Hegel, Marx, and other philosophers. I'll also point to Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. So first he says, Black cannot be defined on its own because it does not exist outside of its particular context. He writes, ontology, once it is finally admitted as leaving existence by the wayside, does not permit us to understand the being of the Black man. For not only must he be Black, but he must be Black in relation to the white man. So this definition, he says, can only result in the negation of being, because consciousness of self, in the Hegelian sense, in its immediacy, is simple being for itself. And this formulation by Hegel, in his writings on recognition of self and other, informed the Western tradition's understanding of the human subject and its parameters. Hegelian consciousness, taken up by existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre, could not be reconciled with racism's designation of Black consciousness as incomplete. Phenomenology, a philosophy which emphasizes the role of the body as the primary site of knowing the world, could not account for racism's embodiment. In Merleau-Ponty's corporal schema, the reciprocal and fitting relation between the body and the world give rise to the possibility of a mutual construction and transformation of both self and other. But this implies agency over one's body. So how then does the Western tradition account for Black consciousness? Fanon calls the above definitions a negating activity for Black people. It is a third-person consciousness. Being conscious of one's body in this case only brings about awareness of the atmosphere that surrounds it, which is one of uncertainty. In direct response to Merleau-Ponty, he writes, "Below this corporeal schema, I have sketched a historical racial schema. The elements that I used have been provided for me not by residual sensations and perceptions primarily of a tactile or visual character, but by the other, by the white man who had woven me out of 1,000 details, anecdotes, and stories. The construction of Blackness," he goes on to say, "proves that at its extreme, the myth of Blackness, the idea of Blackness, can become a decisive factor of an authentic alienation." African-American sociologist Du Bois's work on the concept of double consciousness helps to further elaborate. Double consciousness was used to capture the character of this Black consciousness, an identity divided, he says. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness. What both Fanon and Du Bois speak to here is, of course, the inability to define oneself, to control one's own narrative. And as they aptly conclude, the tools provided by the Western tradition and, of course, billed as universal are not only ineffective, but deliberately exclusionary. Of course, those conversations are as well incomplete. Neither Fanon nor Du Bois provide an analysis of gender, queerness, or otherwise. They adhere to the Enlightenment framework of man and his rights. What is accomplished through these works, though, was in many ways to posit the experience of Blackness as a direct challenge to the universalist project of humanism, centering alienation. And so many scholars and thinkers across various fields, from Marx to Westworld, have dedicated pages to exploring the wonders or horrors of revolt by the oppressed. And if only they could clue into the nature of their oppression, redeeming themselves, they will have finally achieved the status of human via self-consciousness as such. But the human and its political counterpart, humanism, emerges as a particular subject, a product of the Enlightenment and drawn within the boundaries of the white European male and his life. For Hegel, human reality denotes a social historical reality of being, not simply a mere fact of its existence as an object of nature. And for Fanon, he struggled, of course, to recuperate this humanism from its narrowly defined vision of what it means to be human, and to bring Africa and her descendants into this history, a history denied to them by Hegel and others. So for Fanon, alienation is a key element of the experience of Blackness, but he imagines Black subjectivity as overcoming this alienation via revolution. Of course, that's directly related to Fanon's involvement in the decolonial movement across Africa in the 1950s. For Fanon, overcoming this alienation would occur when Black and white refuse to let themselves be sealed away in the materialized tower of the past. Disalienation will come into being through their refusal to accept the present as definitive. And what's wonderful here, of course, is his gesture to the importance of time in its construction of self and other, and particularly, of course, how it relates to the Black subject. But of course, not all believed in overcoming this alienation. A great example would be in 1805, following its revolution and its successful liberation from French colonial rule, Haiti's new constitution declared itself the first Black republic. Responding to France's declaration that men are born free and remain equal in rights, Haiti declared, all exception of color among the children of one and the same family, the family here being the nation, the Haitians shall henceforward be known only by the generic appellation of Blacks. So this was done alongside banning the ability of whites to own property and the abolition of slavery. Haiti's revolution, a result of a slave rebellion and a direct repudiation of the historical project of white supremacy via its slave trade in the colonies, fulfilled the universal project through its own means. By defining all her citizens as Black, Haiti and her people understood Blackness as a form of liberation. As opposed to the French's purported value of freedom for all men, the Haitian Revolution declared freedom for all Blacks, regardless of color. And just as white in this case represented a propertied or slave-owning class, Black represented the idea of democracy, equality, and the possibilities for a new future. So despite this rich historical and philosophic worlds inhabited by Black subjectivity, the contemporary conceptualization of Blackness is still struggling to break from its constructed one-dimensionality. The hegemonic archive of Black culture in the world is one of objectification, one that has little to no control over its reality. And in response to the failures of the Enlightenment and its promise of a universal truth, freedom for all, we have today an embrace of the alienation thrust upon Afro-diasporic subjects through the power of speculation. Our conversations about the future and its imaginary often revolve around what is possible in the future. But for many, from Black radicals to Afrofuturists, the question becomes who is possible in the future, not only as a passing commentary, but as an integral part of imagining what the future could look like. And this, in fact, is a question of design. So as a student of political theory, I have been oriented towards the past. Through history, we are told, we come to know the world, even when we're committed to changing the future. Future analysis has always been looked down upon with skepticism and suspicion. The futurist movement of the early 20th century, with its glorification of modernity and its association with fascism, left many uneasy. Seen as not rigorous, detached from reality, and other epithets directed for what is perceived to be its denial of history. Futurism, as a philosophy, has in fact led to the emergence of present-day ideologies like scientism, a totalizing view of science as if it were capable of describing all reality and knowledge. But Afrofuturism and other futurisms as well that are advanced by the marginalized and maligned of the world have used future orientation as a way to recuperate lost histories and advance alternatives to the present. Alienation as foremost experience of reality has allowed those without space in the present future to imagine society and challenge the social, political, and economic hegemonies that exist throughout it in their art, invention, and narrative building. So how are the insights from Afrofuturism, rooted in this experience of alienation and its advancement via science and technology, relevant to design? So first, I want to say design, of course, has grown vastly in its importance from its traditional role of improving the visual appearance of function and objects, messages, and information. Today, designers are also responsible for constructing reality through objects, environments, situations, affects, and more. The design industry, despite its broad range of specializations, is one of the fastest growing professions. CNBC News reported in 2019 that unsurprisingly, many of the jobs that topped the cognizant jobs of the future index were roles in digital fields. The employment growth in these areas reflects a greater demand for people with the software, cybersecurity, and digital design drive to drive companies' futures. So
10 minutes.
Okay. I just want to move on then to a section. Can we go back to the map, maybe, Petya? So I'm just going to come to one of my examples since I don't have much time here. So we can see the designing of race, which I would have gotten to in many ways throughout history, and I wanted to focus on one example. So in the North American context, the practice of redlining, I think, demonstrates race as a designed object more than anything. So redlining comes from the New Deal's development of maps of every metropolitan area in the country by the federal government. We're talking about the United States here. So these color-coded maps were created first by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and they were later adopted by the Federal Housing Administration, as well as other government bodies. So the codes indicated things like what mortgage rates would be and where it was safe to insure mortgages, depending on factors like the racial makeup of the neighborhood, its professions, and other things. The best neighborhoods were, of course, coded in green, followed by blue and then yellow, and anywhere that African Americans lived and anywhere nearby to their communities were coded in red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky to insure mortgages in, leading to things like predatory lending practices and the underfunding of communities. So you can see in this map the historical relationship between Black communities and the urban center, which today presents itself as a challenge for city officials and urban planners looking to improve their cities. This practice of racial mapping, although it was legally outlawed in the 1968 Fair Housing Act, defines the neighborhoods of American cities to this day. Urban planning inherits this legacy, where who is included in our vision of a desirable or sustainable city or future renders urban, low-income, Black, immigrant communities undesirable. And we see here as well what Eshen had described earlier as the envisioning, management, and delivery of reliable futures. So I want to make the case for those who choose to address these problems in both the critique of the futures on offer and the practice of fabricating new futures and realities beyond the confines of this human subject. So Afrofuturism as a theory, a politics, and a practice represents only one of such possibilities, an openness, a creative rendering. A question that activists today are eager to confront: how do we avoid the all-encompassing fear of the present and what is to come? Climate catastrophe, a descent into explicit fascism, ballooning poverty, more death. And of course, when I started to think through some of this, COVID had not yet become our new reality. So in a world deeply marked by trauma, despair, and a future that's been arrested by fears, an alien imagining of what is possible is not only desirable, but necessary. And because the politics of Afrofuturism seeks to alienate the human subject and its social historical conceptualization, it centers the exploited, the displaced, the oppressed, the aliens in our current configuration. In Afrofuturism's specific endeavor, establishing the historical character of Black culture through its future is to bring Africa and her descendants into a history that has been ultimately denied to them, and to do so by assembling counter-memories, those that contest, cut, and rewrite the colonial archive. Afrofuturism is a way of designing Blackness for the present becoming future. So for myself, the potential of alien politics is this simultaneous standing as something not of this world and also alien on Earth. So the histories, the peoples, the events and practices submerged and displaced by the monopoly powers of the globe. In our construction of new possibilities, futures, and technologies that don't simply replicate our existing world and further entrench its inequalities, we need alien possibilities that defy the limits of what's humanly possible. So by refusing this category, the human, as its central analytic, alien politics provokes a fresh orientation to design, manufacture, fabricate, synthesize, cut and paste, and edit a so-called artificial discontinuum, demanding alien listeners who can hear another world. Many of our stories and our practices of imagination bring us right to the cusp of possibility, but they end up falling short at exploring possibilities beyond our present reality, beyond the current social, political, and economic arrangements that we live within. Ones that play with time and temporality and can reorient the present narratives around racial divide, ecological devastation, and economic possibility. And that's precisely what's discernible in Afrofuturist themes. Relieving the present of its place of priority, we enlarge the horizon of possibility. The current terrain of future imagination has given capital and its proponents a monopoly over the future, drawing power from the particular utopias they promote as a kind of currency to induce a psychosomatic investment in their vision of the future. As this displaces the material and temporal content of actually lived exploitation today, Afrofuturism's alien can help to conjure new tomorrows through a focus on the creative power of non-being, disconnection, exploitation, and alienation. In designing a future with the alien in mind, we synthesize a series of alien on Earth approaches to tackle the problem of past, present, and future. Okay. So I'm sorry I sped through one of these parts. My example of redlining, I also had an art exhibit to go with it, but hopefully we can talk about that in our discussion. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Lina, for this really insightful and dense talk, and that has been so many relevant and interesting points made. So I want to open up the discussion for our guests. If you have questions, please, I don't know, you can raise a hand or you can just unmute yourselves and ask Lina. Yes, and I would also like to ask you actually two things, but one I already forgot. And I would love to, if you could repeat it for me just to get it one more time, the role of Black consciousness in relation to enlightenment, and also what you said, I think you connected it to Frantz Fanon, and and Afrofuturism as like also like core Western concept, or not? I think I got that wrong, but it's where I wanted you to maybe remind me.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah,
I think it's important to to think of this project as being in conversation with this tradition, right? So like this concept of alienation in Afrofuturism is very specific to the way that Black consciousness developed as a response to the Enlightenment, the project of the Enlightenment and universal man, right? And so the example I gave of Haiti was to say that, of course, the French Revolution, as it was taking place and as the call for democracy and a universal subject, and this call for freedom for all men was taking place, France, of course, had its colonies around the world. And as a response, Haiti, a slave society at the time, asked, well, of course, are we included in this category of man and his rights? And the answer is no. So because they were not included, they fought against the French for their liberation from that system and chose to take up the category of Black as a way of expressing that liberation, right? So rather than referring to a sort of the way we consider Blackness as a, a biological construct today, they were thinking of it as a category of liberation, right? So because this category of man did not include them, they used the category of Black to speak to the same concepts, those of democracy, liberty, and the possibilities of something new. So I'm putting Afrofuturism within this conversation because I think it's important to know why alienation becomes central for this particular practice and why they focus on it. And for me, the conversation around consciousness, human consciousness, and who gets to count in this category of man is where this is coming from, is where the first engagements with alienation come from, and also later the adoption of alienation rather than the desire to overcome it, rather than the desire to be included in the category of human, the sort of embrace of alienation as its own experience and as the opening up possibilities for something else.
Thank you. Thank you for summarizing that so excellently one more time. And since we see that speculation is used to promote neoliberal agenda or speculative design sometimes is also just the perpetuation of a neoliberal aesthetic, as a designer, I feel challenged sometimes to see how I can apply speculation in a critical way.
Yeah, I think we are all sort of tasked with the same things, right? Of course, not just as a designer, but anybody engaged in trying to imagine something different to the current world we live in is tasked with this exact problem, right? How to not reproduce more of the same. And I think that this is a difficult question. And so I don't want to take away from, I think a lot of people are trying to engage in a kind of speculation, like I said, that doesn't simply ask questions about what is possible, but asks specifically who is possible. And for me, this is a way that we can sort of begin to think about speculation as opening up new possibilities outside of the current neoliberal capitalist world that we live in. And that, of course, Afrofuturism is not the only field or the only, you know, sort of way of doing this, but there's multiple ways of using speculation to access those questions and challenge the status quo as it is.
My mind is working really hard to bring together all everything. So I want to also give you students and guests also the chance to engage with Lina in this conversation. And yeah, and I see in the chat that you're like that people are saying thank you, Lina. That was so interesting. They want to rewatch it a couple of times, actually, the talk, so they can pick up all these important and extraordinary points that were made. Yeah.
So I will also just say that, yeah, I think what I wanted to do for this talk was largely just sort of anchor the concept of alienation in a historically specific place, and to say that this is the conversation that was taking place. And even though some of the people that we read, or that I read here for you, desired for that to be overcome, that experience of alienation actually in this category of Blackness to sort of fall away, we can say, that has changed, right? And that has shifted, and there are lots of people who now see it as like a grounding for a different kind of experience and a different way to look at the world, right? And so I want to leave open those possibilities. And I think when you all sort of have your conversations in the next few weeks about speculative feminisms as well, this is another attempt to engage with the possibility of different others in the future, right? So not just asking what is possible, but who is possible.
Yeah, I think that it could be actually also a really interesting method, because right now speculative design really starts with the what if scenario, but we could also change that. Like, what would a what if sentence be in this? Like, for like whom?
Who if?
Who if? For whom? For whom? Who can?
Yeah.
Yeah. Evelyn, you have a question. Please unmute yourself. You're free to speak.
Hi, thanks so much for the super interesting talk. I just wonder all the time, I mean, race, class, gender, we are really in academia, because I also work in academia, we are so much reading and getting aware which kind of bad societies we live in, but what kind of spaces would you maybe personally wish yourself to bring in the discourse? I wonder what kind of space are you wishing for, is maybe needed, where are laws needed, and which could be also invaded? I don't know if you have a thought about that.
So what kind of spaces? I mean, I think definitely, I mean, you all are doing a different kind of, at least for me, a different kind of academic there's a different kind of academic production that's going on, because it is largely based, to my knowledge, in materials. And so an example from my own field of politics, I think it would have to engage with what's actually happening in everyday life. And so I personally am drawn towards sort of the things that maybe are sometimes thought of as boring or routine, you know, just the everyday struggles for things like housing, and in any way that we can sort of think of the possibility of what the future could look like, even in the most obvious of ways. And so one might not think of something like, you know, people who organize, let's say, for harm reduction. I think that's a good example, something that doesn't really fit into our current, at least, I assume as well across Europe, but at least in North America, it doesn't fit into our general idea of what is utopia, right? I mean, a drug user is somebody who would be considered largely on the margins, outside of, you know, what we want to think about. And so people who engage in this kind of work, in harm reduction work, when I think of in Toronto, people who do that work, every day, the attempt to build a reality that includes those people and not just humanizes them, because of course, pushing past who gets to be a human, right? And who we get to humanize, who is deserving of those categories, and including those people simply by paying attention to their needs, right? And offering them the things that they are otherwise denied. Even if it's something like making sure that they have access to safe drugs, so as to not be, you know, another victim of a, you know, tainted drug supply. But this is, of course, like I said, it's something that people would not consider part of, like, let's say the design of a city, or spaces where people could do that would not really be considered part of a vision of the future, right? I mean, all these people are, like I tried to say, excluded from the history. We exclude them from the history we want to build, and therefore they don't have to be considered in our vision of the future.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That is also really eye-opening now that you say that. Of course, and you mentioned it earlier, something about that we always assume that, but it was about technology. If technology doesn't work right, that it must have been the glitch, or it's a glitch and not actually the way that it was actually meant to function. Do you want to pick up on that one more time to refresh?
Sure. And I mean, I think these are a lot of these criticisms. I don't want to say they're me, right? They're not coming from me. So many people have written about these things. In that book, in Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology, she also talks about this idea, right? The design of the technology itself as not just being, not only banal, like something that is, you know, neutral and can be worked with later, but rather like it comes with its own implicit understanding of the world, how it works, you know, who is its subject, all of these questions. But she also goes further to say that because those things are not addressed, it actually further intensifies those exact things that we are naming as like wrong with it, or, you know, let's say the targeting of certain people. It actually further intensifies those experiences. But I think part of what I wanted to say wasn't just that, of course, these spaces are, of course, they're being deployed by power, but that they are also spaces for us to enter into and to have these discussions. And I think that that's important, because why leave these spaces only for the, let's say, further intensification of society's inequalities, right? It wouldn't be great to like conclude that, you know, it's just already co-opted, so we have no use for it. But it's, you know, it's hopefully to highlight that we actually need to be involved in these exact questions at all times, because there's already on the other side of it power involved in these exact questions at all times, right? For its own design.
Yes. There's a new question also in the chat, but I'm also thinking about, like, building on what you said, the invisibility, or like the designed invisibility, and then what is not present here or not wanted to be seen also doesn't get a vision for the future in a way. But it's also, of course, about not what is the right word? Not only not separating these spaces, right, to make them even more marginalized in a way. So there's a request. It says, I think Lina said there was an art show she wanted to mention. Is there still time to talk about that? You're muted, Lina, I think. Who muted you?
I did. Maybe I did already say it, but for my example of redlining, I wanted to point to there's an art exhibit that is called Undesigning the Red Line, and it's all about, it's an interactive exhibit. You walk through, you learn about the history of redlining, you learn about the sort of lingering, of course, effects of this design, and then it invites people to be part of the policy discussion around what undesigning this practice would look like. And I thought that was really interesting and a really engaging way to sort of deal with the history. I can put it in the chat as well. Maybe I'll do that.
Yes, thank you. And I mean, there's also design practices within policy design, and there's like all these methodologies that are human-centered, but I think they also like have the same issues that you've been mentioning. So I was wondering if there's like any like people who work with space or spatial design or policy design or architecture in here who would like to contribute and who have questions or comments. Otherwise, it's also already past 7, so we're officially taking more than the hour that we're usually planning to take, and it's also fine if you don't have any more questions or anything that you want to share. If we continue towards closing the session and we sit with all the extraordinary points that have been made and let our bodies process them also.
There's a question in the chat, but I think it's a wonderful question, and I don't know how to answer it. I've never written anything for a younger audience, but I think that's just yeah, I will think about that.
I don't see the question.
I don't think we see it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just sorry, maybe it was a private question, but if I've ever written anything for a younger audience, or if I would have thought to, I don't know how to answer that question, but it's something for me to think about. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not, so maybe I will, the last thing I'll say is that that's a good question. Maybe that's also, I'm not sure if I misunderstand the question. Maybe it's a question about accessibility too of the thought. I mean, I think that's also, maybe a difficult question, of course. I aspire, let's say, as somebody who works with theory, to make it as understandable as possible. Maybe through the use of examples, but it's a good question of just to think about what that would look like to an audience that maybe wasn't familiar with the broader conversation, the broader theoretical conversation.
I particularly also still carry these words within me that you said, that you spoke on the psychosomatic, like sort of buy-in into somebody's vision, and how important that is actually, how through the visual and the narrative we're physically affected, and this is actually what it takes for the change to happen.
It's true, and I think that's what's really that's also very maybe unique to design as a field and very important. Something that can't always be done, or can't be done mostly at all by people like me. You know, to try to represent these things in a different form. But yeah, I mean, we're already sort of dominated by the vision of the future as a sort of, I think at least, like the techno-utopia, right? Where like technology will eventually make life easier. I made a joke to my friend earlier that, you know, I might be tired and, you know, working 40 hours a week, but probably what I want is like, you know, the latest, I don't know, let's say vacuum technology so that I don't have to clean my house, you know, like this is also something that's part of my, you know, vision of like what the future could look like. Life could be made a little bit easier through something like this. And we do buy into those things. And so it's very powerful, right? The kind of creative sort of imagining what is possible that is done in design is a very powerful field. And so my only intervention is to say that yes, the questions of who in this sort of serve to really challenge the power structures that we live in and what they have offered us of what is possible.
Yeah, I think that is a very important addition to what speculative design is also trying to do, trying to actually reveal the values inherent in design, and like through this addition also through the who you can actually access the question of power. Yeah.
I don't remember who said this, but I know I heard it from someone else. Like never underestimate the power of the timetable of the everyday, and I think that's pretty true. And also, like in what you said, you described pretty much that.
Yeah, and I mean, listen, it's very easy to escape us, right? I mean, even in my work, sometimes it's easy to focus on the bigger picture and think that that's also where all the work is being done, when every day what's being reproduced is in some way an endorsement of what already exists. We endorse what already exists by, in our everyday, recreating more of the same.
Yeah, processes of normalization are through habituation, and yeah.
So we are past our time.
We are officially past our time. I'm really so grateful for all the work and thought that you put into this, and I also really enjoyed the examples and the parallels you draw, that how it, like the Mars projects of Elon Musk are just another just good continuation of colonial gestures, and it's not critical and it's not questioning, and how in this context speculation is not critical, and and that is also like a very important aspect that we need to talk about and think about. What kind of gestures are we reproducing and perpetuating also? Yeah. So thank you so much for this. I'm blown away, honestly, on a new moon after a solar eclipse. Oh my God, Lina. That was really nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for inviting me. It's always great to talk to people. And I know that you also take part in a more sort of interdisciplinary approach. That's not always there for me. So I love having conversations with people in different fields. It's very interesting.
Yeah, you're getting lots of thank yous in the chat. And Lina was also blown away. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for your time and brain, and for sharing. Yeah.
Thank you. I hope it was helpful.
I think very much so. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So thank you all. Lina, if you like, we can stay a few more minutes and figure out some details if you need anything about the bureaucratic process. Otherwise, you're free to go. Thank you all.